Good morning. Thank you all for being here. We're going to get started soon. My name is Em. I'm one half of the care coordination team.
I'm Lashania, and I'm the other half of the care coordination team over at Washington.
And we're here to start off our day together in our witnessing and for all the witnesses to make a commitment together to uphold the values that VTRC has set forward to hold this process and these stories with grace, equity, and humility. Grace. Empathy, grace, empathy, and humility. And so to get us all on the same page and to just get us into the space a little bit, I invite you to feel your feet on the floor, and if it feels available to you, you can close your eyes or cast them down. And I'm going to start with a hum, and I invite you all to join me in humming, and we'll hum together just for a few seconds, just to get us all co-regulated together as we prepare to bear witness. So I'll start on 3. All right. And in order to hold this space together, we're going to ask for a commitment from each of you to those values of empathy, grace, and humility. And so I will point to each of you and ask you to say that you commit to those values. You can say I commit or committed or whatever feels right to you. I'll start with you.
I commit.
I commit.
I commit.
Great, thank you all. I'll pass it over to the commissioners.
So, sorry, we're sharing this mic. My name is Mia Schultz. I'm one of the 3 commissioners, and I'm going to give a land acknowledgement today. A few years ago at this high school, the Rutland area NAACP presented a handmade tapestry created by an indigenous artist and educator, Judy Dow. It was created after the removal of a harmful mascot. Woven into that tapestry that now hangs in these halls were the 5 R's: respect, responsibility, reciprocity, relationship, reverence, and relevance. I think that's 6, but it all interweaves, you'll see. Those words were not decoration. They are teachings, a reminder of lessons that the land has been offering ever since the beginning of time. This valley, the place that we now call Rutland, rests between Green Mountains and the Taconic Range. The Otter Creek moves through it, steady and deliberate, carrying stories and life from one season to the next. The forests breathe in rhythm with the wind. The soil holds memory of rain, of root, and of all who have walked here. Here are the 5 R's. They are the way the land lives. Respect in how the river shapes its course, creating space for every form of life along its banks. Responsibility in how the mountains hold their snow through the winter and release it in the spring, sharing life at the right time. Reciprocity in how each fallen leaf nourishes the soil that will nourish the next generation of trees. Relationship in the quiet exchange between roots and fungi, wind and seed, light and growth. Reverence in how this land continues to offer beauty, sustenance, asking only for our gratitude and care in return. And relevance in how these teachings still matter now, calling us to remember that balance with this earth is not a story of the past, but a responsibility of the present. This is the homeland cared for and stewarded by the Abenaki people and shaped in different times by the Mohican and other indigenous nations whose footprints and prayers remain here. The teachings they lived by and still live by echo through this valley. They are carried in the waters, whispered through the trees, and held in the stones beneath our feet. And if we listen closely, the land reminds us that belonging is not something that we claim, it is something that we practice. The mountains are asking for respect. The rivers are reminding us of responsibility. The soil is teaching us reciprocity. The wind is whispering about relationship. This land invites itself to reverence. And in this moment right now, we are calling for relevance because the earth is alive, still sacred, still speaking, and we are here to listen.
Okay, hi everybody. Melody, one of the commissioners. And I am a little sick today, so if I start coughing too much, I just want to let you know I'm not being disrespectful. I'm going to leave so I don't interrupt people's testimonies or statements and truths. All right, so I want to speak to the theme a little bit today, which is spiritual and cultural identity. So what does belonging mean to you? As humans, our cultural and spiritual identity is the path we lay before ourselves to navigate the world. It creates a sense of belonging in a very human experience. When we feel lost, these values we hold closest are the guideposts by which we can return to recenter ourselves. One of my friends at the beginning of this entire process, Rejan Obamsawin, told us something about truth and reconciliation that we have taken with us every step. He said, "Do you know what truth and reconciliation really is? It is a recentering of ourselves as individuals to all our relations, from our families, friends, and communities to the land itself. The values that guide us and create the path that we take inform how we establish and maintain all of our relationships. And this includes our relationship to the land itself, to ourselves, and to each other. What happens when this path that is meant to guide us to a beautiful existence is replaced? What happens when those values that are meant to provide positive value systems of reciprocity and community and love are replaced with alternate systems that create shame, confusion, heartbreak, and division? Broken values create broken people and broken systems. What values do we all wish to live by that we can center ourselves and recenter our communities?" Today's theme of spiritual and cultural identity also includes language and communication, religion, spiritual practices, identity, self-worth, artistic and creative expression, honor, joy, and overall our quality of life. So, who would we all be if we were truly free? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Roderick. I'll be the event facilitator for today. I just want to take an opportunity to review our working pledge. So if you pay close attention, please. As we explore complex and challenging topics such as race, disability, oppression, and discrimination, we collectively pledge to approach these discussions with a commitment to extend grace, humility, and empathy with each other. We recommend that we are all on We're all on both an individual and collective journey to dismantle oppression and discrimination from our culture and systems. Therefore, we pledge to cultivate dignity and respect even in moments of disagreements and discomfort. We expect and accept non-closure, and then with that, we engage in courageous conversations with curiosity and an open mind. We dedicate ourselves to refrain from judgment, embrace active listening, and use I statements to foster open communications. In this space, we understand the platinum rule, where we pledge to abide by each other's unique preferences, thereby building better relationships and collaborations. We come into this with good intentions, but also recognize that even when we do not intend to do harm, there is an impact. We commit to prioritizing Act 128 communities and acknowledge that there is no such thing as a single issue struggle. Our lives are interconnected. We vow to treat each other, our stories, our dreams and struggles with sacred care. We honor vulnerability. We embrace the spirit of co-creation. We affirm that we are the active agents of change, and we are committed to doing the work to create understanding amongst and with each other. The journey to collective liberation is filled with discomfort and painful truths, but the final destination is community, where everyone can thrive together. This is a shared space grounded in the principles of this pledge.
Thanks, Roderick. Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see you. Oh, I'm just going to hold it. It's lovely to see everyone today. My name is Faith Yakubian. I use she, her, they, their pronouns, and I'm the executive director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I have some logistics and safety things to go over, so just hold on, hang on, we will continue in a bit. Before I go into that, I'd like to thank Rutland High School for providing their space, their hospitality, thank you so much, and for accommodations and safety items. We have subtitles running, and those are for folks who would prefer or need to read. We won't have them on the entire time, but we will have them on periodically. We are also live streaming this event for the folks who are unable to attend or who would prefer to attend at home or elsewhere, and we thank Brattleboro TV for being part of our team today to make that possible. Today we were unable to have ASL interpreters, which we apologize. It is a pillar of our work for accessibility, be at the forefront of our work, and we will do better. We will do better. The final video will have ASL interpreters providing ASL for folks. We also have Dr. Van Dora Williams with us today. She is the documentarian, and we are grateful for her presence capturing these important moments. Gender-inclusive bathrooms and gender-specific bathrooms are at the front entrance to your right if you are entering the building. You can find the bathrooms there and also find a volunteer who usually they have a yellow bandana on them. They may not have one, but they'll have a purple shirt on. Please do look for them if you're looking for bathrooms or any other spaces. To support our collective and individual health, we have masks available. We have sanitizers on the different areas of the tables. Please use them at your leisure as you see fit. We also have a HEPA filter here, thanks to Randy, to purify the air, keep us safe. We are also joined by Susanna Davis from the Office of Racial Equity, whom we are so grateful. Hey, Susanna. Please stop by and speak to her, learn more about the Office of Racial Equity. We also have Aurora Berger with us today. Hey, Aurora. And Aurora is providing artwork for ways of processing what you're hearing today and also just to engage in community. At the end of the commission, we will install an art piece with the combination of all the art pieces a collaborative work, and we hope to hang that or have that installed in the State House. Michelle Olvera, who is our general legal counsel, is here as well. She is working with one of our honorary witnesses, Liz Harrington, and she will be doing private truth tellings for those who would like a private session. We also have some of our amazing honorary witnesses here today. I see Alex Hillard is here. I know Anthony Rivers is here. Hey, Anthony. Hey, Alex. And then we also have Mary Gannon here as well. Hello, Mary. It's great to see you. Oh, and Diana Stevens. Oh my gosh. And Lisa Ryan. Oh my goodness. We have like 7 different honorary witnesses. Wonderful. Sorry. I apologize. Jessica is our photographer, and she is moving about. You might see her. She's in the back. Hey, Jessica Robles. She's here as well to support us and take photos of this event. And lastly, you will notice that there are tissues around. And I'm just going to read what it was provided to me because I think it's so beautiful, and it's by Commissioner Mackin. We're continuing a tradition set by Brenda Reynolds of the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who gifted us a ceremonial release she developed. She offered this to us during a training she led for our CARE program. We invite you to place tissues you use to hold your tears, especially those of truth tellers, in the basket that is located the bottom of this table that the commissioners are sitting at right now. And also there's baskets near the end of your aisle or your seats. These tissues will be burned as an offering during a ceremony that we will schedule in the near future. And with that, I get to turn it over to the commissioners to continue.
So if our first truth teller can come to the table, please. Thank you. Hi, Mary. Here's some water for you. Okay. Yeah, however you want to, whatever's comfortable for you.
That's good.
You good?
Is that good for the mic? Or does it need to be closer? I'm sorry.
No, I think you're going to have to push it. There you go.
Okay, that's probably
Perfect.
better.
Go ahead.
My name is Mary Garish. I have lived in Vermont about 20 years. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. I am a proud grandmother and a Lakota woman, and I'm a lawyer. And I went into law because I saw so much injustice in the world that I knew I had to help out somehow. I believe we are all related, and that particular statement means that only love can overcome hate, and that I am a member of the Episcopal Church, which coincides very well with those beliefs. And now I live in Vermont, and I am honored to be here today.
Thank you, Mary. I am going to ask questions for Mary, as that is her preference for moving through her truth-telling statement. At the VTRC, we allow our truth tellers to present however feels most comfortable for them. So you will see throughout the day different ways that people show up. For Mary today, we're going to ask you questions because that's what you have asked for.
Correct, I did.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction. I know that you want to specifically talk about interactions that you've had with the police.
Correct.
Can you tell us about your first interaction in Vermont with police?
I can. My first interaction happened a few years after I moved here. I had a family member who unfortunately had a substance misuse disease. and I was at the time using paper checks. And that person stole my checkbook and was writing bad checks all over the place. I had worked with my bank about this. The police were aware of it. And then one day the police came to my house to arrest me for writing a bad check in Massachusetts, which I hadn't even been in Massachusetts at the time that they said it happened. And so they arrested me and they took me down to booking in the town's police station. And the officer was going through my wallet, taking everything out like they always do. And he came across something with a Lakota name on it. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, you're an Indian? Woo, 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 woo." And I mean, I know what my rights are. I'm a lawyer. But it really intimidated me because it made me feel that somehow he was making fun of me and my identity, which I know is not uncommon, but I had never experienced it personally before. So I said to them, all you have to do is look at the signature on the check, because my handwriting is terrible, as anyone who knows me can tell you. All you have to do is look at the signature on the check, because the person that was forging it was very carefully writing out every letter, right? And they said, no, this is a warrant out of Massachusetts. They have to come pick you up within 3 weeks' time. You're going up to the women's prison in Vermont. And I was like, well, can I call a lawyer? And they said, oh, you've probably got one on retainer. I said, what? I was totally confused, like I had no idea. And they said, do you have the lawyer's number? And I said, no, I don't have a lawyer. I wanted to call a lawyer. And so they put me in the holding cell. And I don't know how many hours later, somebody came down from the women's prison up north, and I was still in cuffs at this time, and put me in the van and took me up to the women's prison where they booked me. And I was really shocked because I know that, I mean, I've had clients who have been in prison, so I know it's not the best place to be. But there was a big difference for when it was me. And I don't mean that I'm any more important than anybody else. I just mean the impact. I also have and have had most of my life, a depressive disorder, which makes me think that I don't have a lot of self-worth anyway. I mean, I've gotten therapy, I'm on meds, whatever. But I'm just saying that had an impact as well. And so I was up there and really was not sure how to handle any of this. And so finally they told me, after a few weeks, they said, Massachusetts is coming to get you tomorrow. And they brought me down to the holding cell where the officers were going to pick me up. And so I was the only one down there. So the officers from Massachusetts walked in and said, and looked at me and said, where's Mary? We're here to pick up Mary Garish. And the prison guard said, that is Mary Garish. They said, no, Mary Garish has blonde hair. And she goes, well, she probably dyed it so you wouldn't recognize her. I go, no, I'm telling you, I've been saying this all along. It was not me on the camera at that store in Massachusetts. Anyway, they took me to the Massachusetts prison, and the next morning they brought us breakfast, and there was a spoon and some cereal, which I'm not crazy about cereal, but anyway. So when I was done, I gave the tray back to the guard who came to pick up the stuff. And then they brought lunch, and it was soup, and there was no silverware on the tray. So I went over to the guard and I said, may I please have a spoon? And she said, what did you do with your spoon from breakfast? I said, well, I left it on the tray. Well, then I guess you'll have to drink it out of the bowl. And so we went to court the following day to get me arraigned in Massachusetts. And legal aid did send a lawyer while I was waiting. And I said the same thing to him that I had said to everybody else. And he said, okay, well, obviously you're going to plead not guilty, and we'll see if they can release you on bond, which I didn't know how I was going to pay anyway, but whatever. So, and meantime, I hadn't been able to call any of my family. My kids were freaking out. I mean, but anyway. So I went to court, and the lawyer presented my case. I pleaded not guilty. And the state's attorney or prosecutor, whichever it's called in Massachusetts, I forget, said, oh no, we've got the evidence right here. And they said, well, let's look at the check. And I said, that isn't my signature. Just look at my license or something, and you can tell that's not even close. So the judge said, and then the prosecutor said, and she has a criminal record in Vermont for this sort of thing. And I said, what? No, I don't. And so the judge said, well, where's the evidence? And they said, well, we're waiting for the town police department to send it up to us. And the judge said, no, we'll adjourn for 3 hours, and you go get them to fax it to you. So we come back in 3 hours, and the prosecutor says, no, I'm sorry, their fax is broken. They can't fax us anything. And so the judge says, well, how long is it going to be till they get it fixed? He says, well, I called them, and they said it'll be a couple hours. So they said, all right, we'll come back in the morning. We went back in the morning. Oh, gee, I'm sorry, we still didn't get that information. Mostly because it didn't exist, right? So they finally decided they would let me out of prison, and they actually allowed me to call my son because they were letting me out to the street in Massachusetts. And so my son, who was a student at Southern Vermont College, actually got one of his teachers that I had worked with on other issues to come pick me up, and we went home. And am I taking too long?
You are not. I'm pulling
Okay.
up more questions.
All right, okay.
I'm so sorry.
So then that was really weird, and what was even weirder was that spiritually, I know that I didn't do anything, and I know that nobody at my church would ever, even if I had, they would still love me. But when I went to church for the first time, I was embarrassed to go. And I was a Sunday school teacher, and I even said to one of the vestry members, said, okay, if I still teach Sunday school? And she said, of course, what are you talking about? I mean, but that's how much I felt like it was a label. And I also know that if I felt like that, I can't even imagine what other folks feel like. But anyway, so then about a couple years later, I was at home, and my son was home from college for vacation, and I had a heart attack, and it was late at night, maybe 11 o'clock. I didn't know it was a heart attack. I just knew that I could hardly breathe, and my arms hurt, and so my son calls 911. So they send a police car over. I'm sitting on my front porch, and I live in a neighborhood. I should preface this by saying, I live in a neighborhood that is that I love, that has very great people in it. Unfortunately, most of Bennington thinks because it's a poor neighborhood economically, and because a lot of people have to self-medicate for health problems, that it's a dangerous, terrible place, right? It's not. My neighbors are great. So the policeman comes, I'm sitting on the front porch, my son's out there with me, and he says and I can hardly talk, and he says to my son, what's she been drinking? And he said, she doesn't drink, she can't drink because of the medication she's on. Well, then what kind of drugs did she take? And my son said, she didn't take any drugs. And he said, she must have taken something, look at her. My son's like, so they're going back and forth. My son's really getting angry. And he's like, get an ambulance here now. And he was, so finally he calls an ambulance. They come over, they take my blood pressure, they look at me, they go, uh-oh, right to the ER. I get in the ER. They said they called a helicopter. I'm going to have to be airlifted to Albany. They had the paddles ready because they didn't think I was going to make it. And we had spent like at least 5 minutes. I mean, to me, it seemed like hours, but I don't know how much time, but a lot of time arguing. And they said at the emergency room, why didn't you just call an ambulance and come right in? I said, well, we called 911 and they sent a police car. And anyway, the good news was I did get airlifted to Albany, and they immediately started intubating me right as I was getting off the helicopter, and I made it, so that's good. So that was, I thought about it afterwards, and although I was really grateful to be alive, I mean, I thought, what in the heck? Like, if my son hadn't been there to be really angry and insisting, I don't know what I probably wouldn't have made it, right? So that just, and that reinforced my commitment to be an advocate for folks, because, you know, like, this happens, worse things happen to people than what happened to me, right? So about a couple years later, one of my neighbors, black man, very nice family, they live in the same building I do, or they did, they moved, but he pulled in the driveway. He had been to the grocery store, and a police car pulls in behind him, no lights or anything. Turn on the lights once they stop the car. They didn't pull in, by the way, till at least 5 minutes after he was in the driveway, because he was already unloading his groceries. And I saw that, and then I could hear, because I had the windows open, it was summer, I could hear them say, we have to search your car. And he's like, why are you even here? Like, they said, we were trying to pull you over. So I go outside, and I'm on the porch, and they're searching his car and literally throwing stuff out of the car. And I'm saying, you can't do that. You weren't. And of course, my neighbor is saying, Mary, just don't say anything. It's only going to get worse, right? And so I was really struggling, because my immediate thing is to say something. Well, as it turns out, they didn't do anything to him except leave everything that was in his car out on the ground and pull away. But that really upset me, and so I started trying to advocate for people. But I also was in a real state, because I don't know what people do or don't want me to do. I don't want to make it worse for them. And I remember how it was for me when they arrested me. And it's just very, very difficult. The third encounter was that there was a young man, also a black man, who, and the way our building is, our apartment, well, it's a house, but they've made it into apartments. It's very old, and it goes back to the river, and so people go back there. There are berries back there. It's the river sounds nice. It's nice to sit by it, you know, that kind of stuff. So people go back there all the time. And I was sitting out on my porch, and somebody had come back there, and no big deal. And all of a sudden, I was sitting with my back to the driveway. I like jumped because I heard these sirens go off right next to my porch, and it was a police car, and they were like roaring down that driveway to the river with their sirens on. And I'm like, what the heck? So I go out back, and I'm like, what are you doing? Because they've got him over the side of the car and all this kind of stuff. And they said, this isn't your business. Go away. And they said, we've been chasing him for 3 miles with our sirens on. I said, no, you haven't. You just practically scared the life out of me when you turned on your sirens when you went by me on the porch. And we had some back and forth, and they told me, go away, you're interfering with arrest. And he was going like so I did. I went away. And I felt terrible because I still didn't know whether I should have gone away or not. And so it makes it, I was thinking about this, and I haven't actually thought about the interrelation between my experiences and the experiences of my neighbors until recently. And I was thinking about it, and I thought, I never realized how, that scared the heck out of me. So when the police are like, you're interfering with arrest, I'm like, oh my God, oh no. All of that comes back. Now, I know it doesn't sound like I was very maltreated compared to some people. But that being said, for me, it made my depression and my lack of self-worth, which conflicts with my passion to try and advocate for people. So it really impacted my life.
Thank you, Mary. So would you say that at any point from the beginning when you first had interactions with police that you felt targeted?
Yes, I do think that, and I think that because I am an advocate involved in a lot of different organizations, and I think that had something to do with it. And I also think that the police were embarrassed the way that they had treated me the first time they arrested me, or they should have been embarrassed, they probably weren't, but whatever. That was like, because in a lot of these instances, complaints were filed, but nothing actually happened, right? So I felt like I was targeted for a lot of reasons. And it made it more difficult. It makes it more difficult for me to live there. I was targeted because I live in a bad neighborhood, according to them. It's not. It's a wonderful neighborhood. But anyway, and I was targeted because of my spirituality is part of why I feel compelled to advocate for people. And that didn't help any. And it didn't help any about their embarrassment with the Massachusetts court. So yes, I do feel that I was targeted.
What amount of time and span of time are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of there was probably about, I want to say, a year or so between the time I got released from the jail, or the prison, whatever it's called, and had the heart attack, okay? And then there's probably about 2 years between that and the incidents with my neighbors that I described.
So within the 20 years that you've been in Vermont, several years after you started
Yes.
experiencing.
Yes. And I still get so if I'm trying to be active in community groups, for example, there are still a number of town folks, people employed by the town in one capacity or another, police or otherwise, that don't even, like, when I talk, it's like they're, they don't even want to listen to me because what I have to say is worthless and it's coming from somebody who, whatever. I don't know. I'm puzzled by it myself, but whatever. Sorry, I can't answer better.
It's a perfect answer. Okay. Doing great.
Okay.
So when you were trying to advocate for your neighbors, did you say you felt compelled to do that because of who you are
Right, I do.
and what you've experienced?
That's exactly right. I felt like I've always wanted to advocate for my neighbors. So I had the experience of knowing what it's like to be in prison for several weeks, which makes me even more passionate about it. And so I really don't know what to say, because it's part of my being and my spirituality to do that kind of work, and it has been my whole life. And by the same token, I don't want to hurt someone else by doing it, and I get a little, and probably because of my depression too, I kind of feel sometimes like if I don't do it, I'm worthless, but then I figure, well, maybe I'm worthless anyway. So it's a very emotional thing that I actually have tried in the past not to think about much.
So part of this work is to find ways, recommendations, and we would like all of our truth tellers to help us with those recommendations.
Great.
So can you tell us how you would have liked to see repair for what you've experienced?
Yes,
And how to move forward?
I would. So in terms of repair for what I've experienced and for what I've seen other people experience, I think that we need to have, well, first of all, I think we need to reclaim the term public safety. Public safety isn't about policing. Public safety is about having a community that supports each other and makes sure that we can each lead a dignified life. So we as communities need to reclaim that, support each other, make sure that everyone has the resources they need to live that kind of life. The other thing is, because right now, at least where I live, and I think in other places, when the term public safety is used, it's mostly about law enforcement. And I have to say that when I was young, growing up, and this is in Detroit even, we had what we called beat cops, okay? And it was always the same one or two people around the neighborhood, and they would go through the neighborhood a couple times a day, and they knew everybody's name, not in a bad way, like I'm keeping track of you, but I mean like, hi Betty, how are you today? You know? And if they saw two teenage boys fighting on somebody's lawn, it wasn't like hands behind your back. It was like, okay, cut it out or I'm gonna tell your mother, we'll go talk to her right now if you don't stop. And they would stop. And if something bad was happening to someone, they trusted that person to go to them for help, not thought that they were gonna get cuffed and taken to jail for even interrupting routine, okay? So that kind of community policing, I think would really help. And it's gotta be more than, it's gotta not just be, you know, walking the beat, a different person every hour. You know, like, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about community relations and interacting with other resources like social, and I know some towns do this, like social workers or, you know, that sort of thing. And recognizing that when someone commits a crime, what we should be looking for is rehabilitation, not punishment, right? So, which our prisons and jails are not geared to, at least for the most part. So that's what I think we need is more of a, and I do know that there's a lot of recommendations for police departments having community engagement and stuff. But I also know that at least one police department, when they were having one of those trainings, a couple of the officers were later joking around about it and thinking it was funny. And so obviously the training, in my view, wasn't effective. So I hope that you all can help us all have a more effective relationship with each other and our communities. Am I good?
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Let's take a moment to breathe together, to let the truth we just heard settle, not to analyze it, but to feel it. This is a space where breath helps us stay connected to ourselves and to one another. Take one slow breath. If you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes or simply lower your gaze. Let your hands rest wherever they feel at ease. Feel the ground beneath you, supporting you. The chair beneath you, holding you. You're here. You're safe enough to breathe. Now take a slow, deep breath in through your nose. Hold it gently for a moment. And exhale slowly through your mouth. Let's do that again. Inhale slowly, evenly. Feel the air move in, cool and alive. Exhale, letting go of any tensions or tightness that's ready to leave. As you breathe, remember, each inhale can be an acknowledgement of the courage it takes to speak truth. Each exhale can be an honoring of the courage it takes to listen. Inhale, honoring Mary. Exhale, honoring yourself as a witness. Let your breath find its own rhythm now. No effort, no fixings, just presence, breath by breath. If emotion arises, know that it belongs. Tears, tightness, warmth, trembling, all are welcome signs that your heart is listening. When you're ready, gently open your eyes or lift your gaze. As you return to the space, carry with you the steadiness of your breath and the knowing that the truth has been heard.
Okay, now we're going to take a 10-minute break. Please visit the community partners or the care team if you need to, as well as the art table. There are snacks and refreshments in the lobby area, but we'll gather again in about 10 minutes. Thank you for attentively listening.
Welcome, David.
I'm sorry. Did someone say something to me? I said welcome. Oh, I'm sorry. I've worked with a lot of machinery in my life, and my hearing is, my wife says, selective. Are we ready for me to go? Okay. Buckle in. Hi, my name is David Searles. I'm a originally from the Hudson Valley. We moved here around the turn of the century. Hard to use that term, isn't it? Because one of my children was in special education, and they had a practice in New York State, and unfortunately, it exists in Vermont to almost the same extent, of putting people with disabilities in their own little classroom. That the children who don't fit into the cookie cutter mold, put them over there. And it's almost that the children who don't need education, who probably would self-educate, they put them in the regular education classrooms. And when 1, 2, 3 of them are highly successful, the education system takes credit for, oh, see what we did. When more than likely, if the kid was given a library card and freedom to study by themselves, they'd probably pretty much obtain the same education. So we moved out of New York in order to escape that. We came to Vermont. It was a little better. And it was mostly because of the smaller school districts. They didn't have enough special education kids to put them in a separate classroom. So, oh geez, so now we'll let them stay in the regular education class somewhat and we'll deal with it. But there are serious problems. And part of that, as a result of me advocating for my child in the school district, I picked up a few skills for advocacy, and picked up a knack for being able to research what the law is. But personally, I've always felt different. I guess we all should feel different, but for some reason, I always felt different. And that my difference offended the institutional status quo, particularly the school districts. I'd just tell you a short story. When I was 16 years old, we'd have, a homeroom. You go to school in the morning, you got your homeroom, and during the homeroom, they'd say the Pledge of Allegiance, and everyone would stand up and say the Pledge of Allegiance. And I said to myself, you know something? This pledge is my pledge. It doesn't belong to the institution. It can't be enforced. And in fact, it shouldn't be enforced. It shouldn't even be encouraged, this public rote display of pseudo-patriotism. So when the Pledge of Allegiance was said every morning, I started just sit at my desk and let the other people say what they wanted to say. And one morning, the homeroom teacher came to me, nice man, Mr. Began, Mr. Chuck Began. He said, Dave, some of the students are complaining that you're not saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Oh. What a pity. And so what we have decided was either you can, when the Pledge of Allegiance is said, you can either stand quietly, or if you really feel compelled that when the Pledge of Allegiance is going to be said, you can go out and stand in the hallway while the other people say the pledge. Oh, okay, Mr. Began, how about if when the Pledge of Allegiance is said, all the people who are bothered by me sitting in my desk, not saying anything, they can go out in the hallway and say the Pledge of Allegiance, and I'll stay here. Well, for some reason, that was not acceptable. So, well, then I had to go down to the principal's office and tell the, essentially tell them that I was being suspended from school for not participating in this group activity. Okay. You want to give me some time off from school? I'm not going to complain. So I went down and went up to the principal's office, and oh yeah, you're suspended and you can't come back to school until you agree that you're going to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay. So I lived in Beacon. Beacon is on the Hudson River about 60, 70 miles south of Albany, the state capital. And I just happened to have a few dollars in my pocket. And so I left school, walked over to the city bus station, took a bus to Poughkeepsie, which is the county seat, and then took a bus to Albany. This is the same day. Took a bus to Albany and walked into the state education department and told them my story, that I'm suspended from school from not saying the Pledge of Allegiance, and I don't think it's right, and that I expect the state education department to do something about it. And I walked into the commissioner's office telling this story, and well, so can I see the commissioner? No, I can't see the commissioner, but you go across the hallway here and you speak to the state education attorney and you tell him your story. So I told him the story, nice guy, and he says, do me a favor, tomorrow just go back to school. And I said, well, they told me not to come. He said, don't worry about it, we'll take care of it. Okay. So I took the bus back home, went back to school the next day, went in, sat at my seat during the Pledge of Allegiance, and nothing was said. Apparently, the state education attorney called my school district and said, leave this boy alone. And that's me in a nutshell. People who know me are not surprised by that story at all, because that's just, I use my differentness as a tool. And I'm very sensitive to, like with my own child, how the institutions treat people who are different. Very, very sensitive. In fact, I had a great uncle who I never met. This is my grandfather's brother. And this is Uncle James. Where's Uncle James? Well, Uncle James is up in Troy, up in Rome, New York. Rome, New York was a state developmental center, something like what used to be in Vermont, the Brandon Training School. And Uncle James when he was a child, he was determined to be feeble-minded. And what do you do with feeble-minded kids? You put them in these state institutions and essentially lock them away. And the parents and the family are encouraged not to visit regularly. Yeah, just let us take care of them, because this is what we do. And so I'm very sensitive to this. Let me drink some water. In 2003, my child turned 18 years old. And this is under the Federal Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that's called the IDEA. Under the IDEA, once a student turns 18, they lose all of up until they're 18, the parents have almost 100% ability to advocate before the school district, enter objections to education plans they want to develop for the child, demand hearings, take them to court if necessary. And with my daughter's, with my child's case, this happened on a regular basis because all they wanted to do was look at the IQ test. Well, she got such and such on an IQ test, so therefore the child belongs in this classroom with these students. And it's very ironic that IQ tests are supposed to measure intelligence, and yet you have the supposedly intelligent people making the most ignorant decisions based on the results of those tests. It's almost like the IQ tests are designed to test the intelligence of the people interpreting the test. It's an absurdity that you can reduce somebody's intellectual ability to a number. But, so anyway, as a result of constant hearings and what were they called? Special education hearings. It's been so long ago. Just constant that because they wouldn't relent on wanting to put my child in a special education classroom, I took both of my children out of school and homeschooled them. And with me, it was not so much homeschool, but non-school. That I came upon this idea that, you know something, kids will learn things you don't want them to learn very easily. So why do we have to spend so much energy teaching them things we want them to learn? Just get them to want to learn it. And so that was my style. But then we decided that we'd move up to Vermont. My children were getting to be high school age. And I said, yeah, I always liked high school. I always liked the tumult of high school. And I said, well, let's move up to Vermont and try the school system up there. And so we moved up to Vermont, and we had similar problems with Vermont for a long while. Finally, we hit upon, and even when we were in Vermont, we moved from one district to another. And finally, we hit upon a school district that had a very perceptive director of special education and recognized what the problem was. And she was able to get everything all fixed to the point where I was very satisfied. That person happens to be the superintendent of the school district. So I just want to give her a nod. But anyway, 2003, my child turned 18, and the child loses the advocacy of their parents at their 18th birthday unless the parents become the legal guardian. Okay. So I went to the probate court and signed out the paper, blah, 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 and they appointed her and appointed my daughter an attorney. And okay, have the hearing. And they appointed my daughter an attorney. They had the hearing, everything's fine, so now we're my child's guardians. And so now, whenever there's a problem, we can advocate her, just like we always did when we were only her parents. And around about 2009, my father became ill, and he was on his way out with cancer. And I started to think about things. Well, what's going to happen when I die? What's going to happen with this guardianship? So I started to look on the law, and this is back at the time when laws started to become available online, where before you had to go to a library somewhere and look up the things, and now all of a sudden you can look these laws up online. And I saw that, I'm looking at the guardianship statutes, this guardianship statute, and then I'm looking at this other thing called voluntary guardianship. Well, voluntary guardianship, what's this? And as it turns out, Vermont is unique. And it's unique by accident. No one sat down and said, let's do this. It just, for some reason, it just happened. Back in 1909, they came up with this idea of voluntary guardianship. And voluntary guardianship is essential. People know what the power of attorney is, where you can designate someone to execute a contract for you. I had to do this when we were buying a house. My wife wasn't available, so she signed the thing saying that I was power of attorney, and I could sign her name as power of attorney. And so voluntary guardianship is like a court-monitored power of attorney program where a person can say, you know something, I want help with the management of my affairs. I want so-and-so to be named as my guardian, and I want that person to have these specific powers. And there's a list of powers in the state statute of what the court can grant. And as long as the person can understand, as long as the court is satisfied that the person understands what they're getting into, the court will grant the voluntary guardianship. There is zero implication of mental incompetence. There's no more presumption of incompetence than if you signed a power of attorney document. And I'm reading the statute. Oh yeah, and it's available to any adult who wants this, who understands the nature of guardianship, except for people who are mentally retarded or mentally ill. And I looked at this. This is 2009. It's hard to say those numbers. 2009, the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed in 1990. So this is 19 years after the Americans with Disabilities Act. Vermont actually has, on the face of their statute, an exception of this voluntary guardianship is available to all adults, except if you happen to have one of these two disabilities. How the hell can this be? And I went to the State Human Rights Commission and complained about this statute, that they need to change this statute. I got a letter back from their executive director. Oh no, well, we've considered this and we're not going to do anything about it. No explanation. And the sad part about it is I'm sure 99% of the people, even more, would take a letter like that. Well, I guess they're not going to do anything, so. Some people you can say no to and get away with it easily. I'm not one of those people, not when you're messing with my kids. So I made an appointment to go up to Montpelier, just like I went to the Commissioner of Education. I went up to Montpelier and I spoke to their board of directors and essentially told them where the bear shits in the woods, and that if they did not fix this, that I was going to be a permanent encampment in front of their office in Montpelier until they fix the problem. Well, maybe we'll do something. And so the executive director tells the board, well, we're not going to take a formal complaint, but he says, I can work with the state legislature behind the scenes and get the law changed. I think I can do this. And well, I heard they're going to do something, so I accepted it, but they weren't going to take a complaint. And he sent me several emails. Let me do this. Don't you go up and speak to the legislature. Just let me do this. So he finessed it with whoever on the committee of whatever legislative committee, and at the last moment of the legislature, they snuck this amendment to the voluntary guardianship statute in. And as a result, the governor at the time, I forget who it was, signed this. And now Vermont has a statute that is a model of the nation for voluntary guardianship. No state in the country has this. And so as a result of this, I go back to the probate court, they change the law, okay. So going back a little bit, so because my child couldn't get a voluntary guardianship, she was given an involuntary guardianship, was And before you can get an you can't get guardianship. There's two guardianships, voluntary and involuntary. And if you can't get voluntary, you have to take involuntary. And if you take involuntary, if you want the protection of guardianship under involuntary, the court has to declare you mentally incompetent. And so I didn't realize this in 2003. I didn't have the statutes. I didn't realize that this is what they did to my child. And so, okay. So I went to the probate court, and I said, well, you know, this procedure in 2003 was in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and also, so when the law was changed, okay, well, we'll terminate the incompetency-based guardianship and now go to a voluntary guardianship. Like, oh, now we're going to go to this voluntary guardianship. Okay, so what about the records where in 2003 you made this determination of incompetency? I want you to go back and I want you to expunge those records. No, we can't do that. Why can't you do that? We don't have the power to do it. Yeah, okay. So I appealed that to the state Supreme Court. State Supreme Court laid out the facts just as they occurred, and they said, this is what the probate court can do, blank, 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 blank. The thing that Mr. Searles wants the probate court to do is not on this list, therefore the probate court can't do it. No problem. So, and again, I guess 999 people out of 1,000 would accept that. So I went to the legislature. I said, okay, the Supreme Court says the probate court doesn't have the power to do this because the legislature hasn't given them that power. So legislature, give them the power. And the status quo is a very revered thing for no reason other than the fact it's the status quo. This is the way we've always done things. Am I running too long on time? I can't let this go without telling a story about my wife's Aunt Fran. Aunt Fran was well into her 80s. I went to a family reunion of my wife's family over in Albany, outside of Albany. And Aunt Fran was the life of the party. She loved to tell stories. And so she's telling a story about some absent family member. When there's a family reunion, you want to go, or else they're going to tell stories about you. So Aunt Fran is telling this story, very interesting story about this absent family member, and her daughter, Beth, overhears her mother telling this story, and she said, "Oh, Mother, you know it didn't happen like that. Why, Beth, it must be true. I've told this story before. And that's how the status quo works. We've told this story 1,000 times. That's how we do things, and the world will come to an end if we change. And the state legislators are a very curious bunch. And it's not unique to state legislators. I had a friend once, this is back with the original school district I was within, and he ran for the school board. I said, we get him on the school board, things are going to change, because he is he knows what's going on. And he got on the school board, and he was just another brick in the wall, as they say. Just like the rest, it's like they get in these jobs and they check their brains or their hearts or whatever it is. They check them at the door, and then they go in and sit there and go along with the status quo. And unfortunately, legislators are like that. And so all it took was one letter from the attorney for the State Department of Disabilities, Aging, and Independent Living to the legislature and say, oh no, we can't do this. Because if we allow them to have this authority, well then everybody can go into court and blah, 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 blah. And the underlying thing that wasn't quite so apparent was the Department of Disabilities, Aging, and Independent Living is the guardian of about 600 individuals with disabilities, developmental disabilities. And this is where we're getting into this. And so they're guardian of 600 individuals with developmental, 600 in Vermont. And of course, they don't want guardians and their parents to go back into court and say, you know, this wasn't right. I want you to go back and fix this. Of course they don't want this. So they had quite a bit of institutional bias, but the legislature, the committee, the Judiciary Committee looked at that letter, oh, they ate that right up, oh, we can't do this. And that was the last hearing they had on the bill that my neighbor, who was a state senator at the time, put in to give the probate court this authority. And that's what we're running into with the legislature is they're incapable of, the state bureaucracies sometimes are so large and so powerful, control so many things, particularly an agency like, they call it DALE, Department of Aging, Independent Living, that it's almost, that they control the status quo. Whatever they allow, whatever they say is okay to do, we'll do. And if they say don't do it, well, you know, they know better than we do. So anyway, now we'll get into the story. And I want to name this piece of the presentation the photocopier experiment. It's an odd name, but I'll pull it in. Within the state government of Vermont, There's a Department of Buildings and General Services, and within that department, there's an Office of Purchasing and Contracts. They put out bids anytime the state wants to buy something. They put out bids, and you can go online, there's a whole list of bids they put out, and people bid on these, and the low bidder, they'll evaluate them, and if they want to buy fuel or contract with somebody to build a road or whatnot, they, as a result of this bidding process, the state, through this office, will contract with people to do this, provide the service, provide these goods. And so as we know, contracts involve two parties agreeing to do something. It's an odd point, but I want you to hold on to that, because I'm going to come back to it. I'm going to be talking about a long list of instances where certain individuals, and I've already talked about it, some part of it, individuals with certain disabilities let me start again. A long list of instances where certain individuals, because of disability, are afforded inferior procedural protections and options concerning their personal affairs, such as control over where they live or where their money goes. There's two systems of adult guardianship under Vermont statute. One in the probate court and one in the family court. The probate court is for people who have someone in their life who is willing to serve as their guardian, a private individual in their life who's willing to serve as their guardian. And it includes people who are not disabled, like under this voluntary guardianship program. As long as you can't get a voluntary guardianship unless you have somebody who's willing to serve as your guardian. And also, there's involuntary guardianship for people who are not capable of giving consent for a voluntary guardianship, or people who actively resist it and need to have a guardian appointed. This is the involuntary guardianship piece. But again, the probate court is only for people who have someone in their lives who willing to serve as guardian. In 1978, they were closing the Brandon Training School. Yeah, Brandon Training School, I'm sorry. They were closing Brandon Training School. What are we going to do with all these people we have warehoused all these years? How are we going to look out after them, especially when during the whole time that they were in here, we encouraged their families to not visit them. And so many of them were in there and had no more connections with their families. So the state came up with, and so at the time, into the late 70s, Vermont had a very ancient guardianship system where you essentially went to see the probate judge and said, you know, Uncle Tony is off his rocker, and okay, well, get a doctor to sign a note and you know, bring Uncle Tony in here, and we'll look at Uncle Tony and see how he is, and if he looks nuts, we'll sign a paper and appoint a guardian for him. And in 1978, when they're closing the Brandon Training School, they looked at that and wisely said, you know, that's not enough for these people that are going to be discharged. And so we want to set up a more formal system. And so they come up with this system of public guardianship, which at the time was a pretty good system compared. I'm sorry?
I'm just giving you a 10 minute.
You're giving me a what?
10 minutes.
I have 10 minutes left?
10 minutes left. Yes.
Okay, I'll go faster. And the this was 1978. 1979, the legislature developed this procedure for the probate court. And it's a much better system than what's over in the family court for public guardianship. And so there's a whole long list of differences between the two systems, which I'm saying is unconstitutional. That the Vermont State Constitution doesn't allow the government to treat groups differently in provision of state services or protections unless there's a damn good reason. And in 2022, I started to ask the legislators, so what's the damn good reason for all these differences? And these differences are listed in this, there's this list. There's a whole set of documents that I've got, and what I'll do is that's support all these stories. And what I'll do is I'll put them into a folder on Google Drive, and I'll make it publicly accessible, and I'll send the commission a link to that, and then anyone who's interested in getting access to these documents can look at them. But this thing about voluntary guardianship, in particular, I wrote to the legislatures, what justifies this? That in this public guardianship system, voluntary guardianship is not available. Voluntary guardianship is not available here, but voluntary guardianship is available in the probate court to anyone, regardless if they're disabled or not. What justifies this? And so this is why state agencies have attorneys. Someone told me one time, and this person happened to be an attorney, it's no accident that lawyer rhymes with the word liar. And so this attorney wrote to the state education department, and I've got this documented, with this, we're all adults here, bullshit answer as to why voluntary guardianship isn't available to the 600 individuals with developmental disabilities for whom the Dale Commissioner is their guardian. And the basis of his argument was, well, you know, voluntary guardianship is like a private agreement that's ratified by the court. And with the suggestion that there could not be a similar agreement as to what the guardianship powers should be in a public guardianship. And that's why I brought up this thing about the contracts. That, geez, the state doesn't have any problem whatsoever contracting when it wants to contract. But now, when it comes to changing the law, oh, no, we can't contract. So this documented in the in the, it's in the documents that I'll have online. This story of this, the reason that this section is labeled the photocopier experiment, 1978, there was an experiment done by someone at Harvard. And back in the day, when photocopiers were a rarity, there'd be, you know, in large offices, there would be a line of people, or at the library, there would be a line of people to get photocopies made. And this researcher made up this experiment. What we'll do is we'll have somebody go to the line and ask to cut in. And they found that if they just they would just come up to somebody, can I cut in the line? The number of people that would allow them to cut in line was down here. But then this was the control group. But then they had the person say that, can I cut in because, and give an excuse as to why they should be allowed to cut in. And they found that the excuse was not understandable, the more compliant people were, because the people didn't want to appear that they didn't understand what the person was saying. And so, okay. And so this is a phenomenon that I think happens particularly with the legislature, is that the state attorneys take advantage of their ignorance. And why don't we have this law changed? Well, because, and they give some bullshit answer. And the state legislatures are dealing with so many hundreds of things, they don't have time to look at the minutia, and it's politically unwise to tell these people they're full of it. And so as a result, we have this system. We got 2 more minutes. As a result of my research, I came across a Vermont Supreme Court case in Franklin C. Russell. Franklin Russell was born in 1930. In 1940, his parents had him committed to the Brandon Training School. He was adjudged a feeble-minded adolescent or feeble-minded child. And at the age of 10, he was put into the Brandon Training School. He was there for 10 years, and just before he turned 21, this is in 1950, he got mad and broke some furniture at the Brandon Training School. And they charged him with a felony, because this is what you do to these people. You can't let these people get away with this stuff. They charged him with a felony of destroying property, and they committed him to the state hospital at Waterbury in a psychiatric ward now for the next 7 years. And somehow an attorney got a hold of this case and took it to the Vermont Supreme Court, and they found that at this proceeding where he was charged with a felony, they essentially asked him, "Are you guilty?" And he said, "Yes." And okay, then you're guilty. They didn't appoint him they did not appoint him a guardian ad litem. And so my point in bringing this up, and so the Vermont Supreme Court overturned the felony conviction, and back in the day, they had no other alternative. They sent them back to the Brandon Training School. My point in bringing this up is that these laws exist and they affect people in a serious manner. And the fact that they are declaring people to be mentally incompetent simply because they don't want to have the availability of voluntary guardianship, they have a whole chunk of people who are declared mentally incompetent, and this label sticks for life. Under federal law, if you have ever been determined to be incapable of managing, of contracting or managing your affairs, under federal law, you are deemed a mental defective. And this is the category of people who can not possess, if you're ever declared a mental defective, you can never own a firearm. And so these things have real consequences. And so I hope that as a result of this truth, and I don't know what this commission is going to do to the first part is the truth, the second part is the reconciliation. You can't, as my understanding of it, you can't have reconciliation until you have a reckoning. And I don't know how that reckoning is going to happen. And I leave it up to you.
What does it look like for you?
I'm sorry.
What does reckoning look like for you?
I have to move, now I have to move closer because I can't hear.
I can speak louder.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
What does reckoning look for you? And
What do I think that you guys ought to do for reckoning? I think you ought to go up there with a torch, stand outside and say, change the law or we're going to burn the goddamn place down. I don't know. I'm not a subtle person as far as how things should be done. I don't know what needs to be done. You are my representatives. You need to figure that out.
thank you.
Yeah.
One more.
Okay.
What does changing the law look like for you?
Oh, I've written up a bill,
Okay.
and that bill sat. This is
Well, why don't you tell us about the bill?
the bill eliminates the two-court system, puts it all in the probate court system, and under a unified set of procedures. Oh, I might as well be asking for their right arm, because this is change, and as we know, change is a very frightening thing. And so in the last legislature, it sat in the committee for 2 years, never was brought up one time. I got it reintroduced this legislature, and last January, it's a bill in both houses, H26 and S5. The judiciary committees of both houses allowed the sponsor of the bill 10 minutes to come in and introduce the bill, and that was the last we heard of that bill. And I'm hoping this is not the case, but sometimes history has a habit of repeating itself, that it's such a complicated bill. We'll just have to put this off. And so hopefully I can just keep beating the drum and making it uncomfortable for them to continue with the status quo. That's all I can do.
Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for allowing me to sit out here because I can't be, I need
It's okay.
space.
We appreciate you. We're just gonna take 2 minutes to hear, to breathe. Inhaling David's truth. Letting it sink. All of us taking responsibility and commitment. Feel your body in your seat. Take 3 big deep breaths. Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys all for your attentive listening. We're going to take another 10-minute break. Also, I just want to remind the witnesses and the audience to give the truth tellers a little space to collect themselves before we approach them and give them the opportunity to approach you if that's what they choose to do. Thank you guys very much for your attentive listening, and you pushed me, man. I mean, you were close on the time limit, but you did a great job.
So my name is Randy, first name, given name at birth, family name Kritkowski. It's a Lithuanian name that I got when my mother remarried. My Native American name, which I think is up there somewhere, is it not? In the second line, is Wishkanabe, which in Potawatomi means he who sees things anew, which seems to connect me with our other speakers, and I suspect most of the people who've testified before you. We see the world in different ways because we've experienced harm, which is very often enlightening as well as painful. I'm a federally enrolled tribal member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, which is now located in Oklahoma. Our original homeland was in a place called Chicago, which in my Potawatomi language was Chicago, or wild onions. That was my homeland before we were driven off at gunpoint. I currently live in Vermont, have lived here and enjoyed it for almost 25 years. I live part-time in Canada, in Montreal, just a few blocks away from where my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, a French fur trapper, voyageur, by the name of Jacques Vieux, lived and worked. We didn't know that until after we moved there. It was as if we had been called back home. Jacques Vieux married a Potawatomi woman, and that is how I became both Potawatomi and French-Canadian. I look more French-Canadian, like my French-Canadian ancestor, than I do my ancestor who was Indigenous. There's a whole story that I could tell, not here today, about how we've racialized Indigenous identity and how this creates problems for everyone concerned. So what I'm doing today in my testimony, let me put my watch down so I don't go over time, and you'll give me the... Okay. I'm going to invite you to join me in a brief journey into the world of being a Native American in Vermont. You got a little glimpse of that earlier, and I think some other people, well, I know some other people have testified on that issue. I was a witness to one such testimony. So as this newspaper, which I've handed out, shouts out, most of our days as Indigenous people begin with a message which comes through in multitude of ways, sometimes insidious as what are called microaggressions, other times screeching from the front page of the newspaper. And what I have here is the Burlington Free Press of Sunday, November 27, 2022, which is a year that is significant for those of us in Vermont who are Indigenous, particularly if you're Abenaki, because it was in that year that some very important events began unfolding and took place at the University of Vermont. I'll get there in a moment. But first, I want to talk about this headline, Erasing Native America, a Tragic Tale. This huge, bold headline. And essentially, what the paper is announcing is that Indigenous people in Vermont have been and are being erased. If you're Indigenous, you don't enjoy being told that you're being erased, that your identity is no longer valid, that you're no longer really present here. But we get that message in so many different ways, over and over and over again. So I'm supposed to talk a little bit about how I have personally been harmed, not some abstract issues of colonialism. Too much has been written about that and read too glibly and not understood. So I'm going to try to bring it down to the personal level. I read this article and was instantly struck by the fact that it refers to events that happened in the early 19th century, in the 1820s, just a short drive from where I live here in Vermont. Happened at the Castleton School. It was a college. And they happened to have what was one of the first medical schools in the United States. And before our country had residential schools at the middle and the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, there were some experiments with taking children away from their homes, not terribly different from the testimony you just heard, and putting them in residential schools where they would unlearn being Indian. You know, the expression was, kill the Indian to save the boy, or sometimes kill the Indian to save the man. So 2 young people who just happened to be Potawatomi, my tribe, were taken from the upper Midwest and sent to the Castleton School to get medical training so that they could come back and help their people. When they got there, they discovered that the person who had sent funds to the school in order to take care of them was basically absconding with the funds. So the 2 young men suffered from incredible deprivations, and a very common thing that plagued residential schools happened. One of them died of tuberculosis very quickly. The other managed to get back home, where he died of tuberculosis. Again, this was 60 or 70 years before my grandfather was taken and sent to the Carlisle Indian School. If you're reading about Native Americans, or if you are Native American, that name will send a jolt of electricity through your body. That was one of 3 residential schools my grandfather went to. So when I read this story, it was not just news, it was shocking, personal, hit close to home story about what happened at residential school. My grandfather never talked about his experience at the residential school. He didn't tell his kids about it. When I was a little boy, I would sit on his lap and he would tell me about living in Oklahoma and all the bandits and the killing and putting the dead bandit in the drugstore standing up in his coffin. He talked about his experience in World War I being mustard gassed, real horrors. But he didn't talk about the residential school. I found out why when I attended a play in Montreal called Children of God, which is about what happened in the residential schools. And I have to say that, like much of the audience of Indigenous descent, I was overcome with emotion and overcome with tears because it came alive. This was the story my grandfather could never tell his children. This was the story he wouldn't inflict on them. He didn't tell me. But sitting in that theater, totally traumatized, I felt the presence of my grandfather's spirit. I felt him whispering to me. It's always hard, this part. I felt him whispering to me, "This is the story I didn't want you to grow up with. You're old enough now. I need to be unburdened." And instead of fleeing to the safe space like you have here, which I was about ready to do, I suddenly felt this feeling of calm, that it was a healing moment for him and for me and my family. And I think that's part of what truth-telling is about. But it's a tricky deal. When do you tell the truth? How do you tell it? To whom do you tell it? Are they old enough to hear it? So I'm beginning with my personal story of my family's past coming back into the present here in Vermont. Okay? And again, the date, for those of you who are Vermont Abenaki, you'll say, oh, that's the year that UVM platformed the Odanak attack on us. Isn't it ironic that one of our biggest newspapers in Vermont decided to celebrate their Thanksgiving edition with a story about erasure? Think about that for a moment. It's not a respectful story. It's not a happy story. So I wrote to the reporter who did it. It was an excellent job of research, by the way. And I said, good job on getting the facts down. I didn't know this. Thank you. Now, would you consider telling the rest of the story? There are Potawatomi here in Vermont today. We haven't all been erased. In fact, we're coming back. I am a diaspora Potawatomi. I am making this my home. I would like to tell that part of the story so that the public here in Vermont will understand we are not disappearing. We are not going away. We are not conquered. We are not subdued. All of our culture hasn't been stripped away. Our identity may have been wounded, but we're building it back. Reporter said, interesting idea. Let me check with my editor. I never heard a word. Never heard a word. Our Vermont media, those of you who are Abenaki know too well, I don't need to tell you, and I'm sorry to beat up on the media, I try to defend them against the current attacks, but our Vermont media here in Vermont love to tell stories about Native Americans in Vermont disappearing. They love to tell the story that the Odanak have brought down about how, well, they actually aren't disappearing because the indigenous people, Native Americans who are here and claim to be indigenous, really aren't indigenous after all. That's the worst, most humiliating kind of erasure, when your kin, who are also from the same origins, I'll use the word tribal because it's more accessible for many people, but the same origins point to other kin and say, no, we don't accept that they are legitimate Native Americans. So if you're indigenous in Vermont, you don't even have to be Abenaki. You wake up to this kind of story revolving over and over and over again in the media. And it is traumatizing. And I use the word with great care. I feel it's sometimes used in the Native American world too frequently, but in this case, I think it is not overused. I have seen, and I know from my own observation and my own conversations, what the emotional and physical impact on Vermont Abenaki and people like me who are not Abenaki but are allies of the Abenaki, what the impact is of this kind of harm. I'll get at the end of my presentation to the question that you've all asked, which is how do we correct the harm and how has the state been involved in it? I'll get to that in a moment. Be patient with me. First, I want to give you a few more examples of how this plays out in Vermont. This Thanksgiving story comes after a prolonged experience I had with another Thanksgiving story. We're coming up to it. You'll be able to see it again. The Wall Street Journal publishes every year, and has done for more than 60 years now, an editorial called The Desolate Wilderness. It appears on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. It's an excerpt from a pilgrim journal of the 17th century, where one of the pilgrims describes what they found when they got here. It was a desolate wilderness. And it was inhospitable if you came from Europe and you didn't know how to survive here and you arrived just before winter. Okay, we all know that story. It's the Thanksgiving story. You know, the settlers, they're starving. And what do? They sit down and they have a big feast with the Native Americans who share their food. The actual story is the settlers stole the food from the Wampanoag. But let's ignore that sad fact for a moment and just say that the Wall Street Journal didn't even acknowledge that the survival of the early settlers in New England, in what we now know as Plymouth, depended upon the land, the generosity and the abundance of the land. It weren't no desolate wilderness. And the willingness of some of the Wampanoag, despite being abused by the settlers, to teach them how to hunt and fish in the winter and survive, and then the next year how to plant crops and survive. So when I read this editorial talking about a desolate wilderness, and not mentioning the kindness and the role that indigenous people played in helping the new arrivals to survive, I got a bit upset. I should also mention that the excerpt from the journal refers to indigenous people as wild men, W-I-L-D-E, the 17th century spelling, and this place as a savage land. I mean, it was a racist editorial, 60 years in a row. So I wrote them a letter, very nice letter, saying you might consider retiring this letter. It really is beneath the dignity of a world-class newspaper. You know, it has racial overtones. No response. I wrote them another letter, a little stronger. No response. There being no response, like the previous speaker, I'm not the person to take no as an answer, I went to change.org, which some of you might be familiar with, and I wrote a petition. It was called Stop Thanksgiving Insult to Native Americans. 50,000 people signed on to my petition. I won an award that year from change.org as one of the change makers of the year. So you're asking, so what was the result? Well, the result was, as we got close to Thanksgiving, and I wasn't getting a response, I got 2 boxes of Indian corn. And I sent 1 box to their editorial staff and 1 box to their news staff, because I knew that the newsroom staff was having a feud with the editorial board over the accuracy of reporting on the news page. And I figured if I kind of played into that, maybe they would open up to the need to correct the misperception and the blatant racism that was appearing on the editorial page. No response to the Indian corn, I thought, until the Tuesday of the Wednesday before the editorial was published yet again. I got up in the morning, opened up my email as usual, and it was full of the most god-awful hate mail I've ever received in my life. I deleted most of it. I should have captured all of it, but you know, the essence was, and I remember one is, you people are an evolutionary dead end. You should vanish. You should be erased. And there, on the editorial page, the day before the infamous editorial that I was trying to take down, was an editorial denouncing me on the editorial page, main editorial, as a radical who's trying to undo a good old American tradition of talking about what we've done in this country. Okay? And in the digital version, the online version of the newspaper attack on me, there was a remarkable photograph attached. No explanation, just a remarkable big photograph. It didn't have anything about Native Americans in it. It was a picture of black people holding signs, Black Lives Matter. I was being accused by a juxtaposition of a visual image and a text attacking me of being one of them radicals that want to undo the white narrative of what it means to be an American. I was honored to be put in the same category, not dishonored. The story didn't end there. The Murdoch family that owns the Wall Street Journal also owns Fox News. Fox News picked up the editorial from the Wall Street Journal, broadcast it. It was then picked up by right-wing radio stations all across America, and I was targeted as one of them radicals. Things have gotten worse since then, I don't need to tell you, but I went to bed that night wondering if some crazy lone wolf or group of not lone wolves, but I won't use the names of the groups, you know them, the hate groups, were going to turn up at my door, okay? I still have that fear. And as much as I feel welcome by many Vermonters in Vermont, I now live with a fear. And I'm not the kind of person, look at me, I'm a white-looking guy, I'm an entitled guy, I'm an affluent white guy. I shouldn't feel threatened. But when you don't see how I look, white guy, if you think of, oh, he's an Indian writing this, I am othered, I am dehumanized, and basically I am put in the box of we need to erase these people. So that was my experience that led up to the next Thanksgiving the same year. And this kind of experience has haunted me for several years now here in Vermont. And this is all my way of leading up to how I responded to the UVM April 2022 event that platformed the accusations of Abenaki, not all of them, some Abenaki who came down across the Canadian border and were given a couple of hours at UVM to claim that they were the only people who really deserved to be recognized as Abenaki. That all the people in Vermont who make that claim, the term they use, are pretendians. Now, I'm not going to sit here, I could do it for days, and refute all the ludicrous, horrifically irresponsible expert scholarly research that went into their so-called claims. But basically what it boils down to is this. The Canadians were applying racialized, late 19th century Canadian quote-unquote Indian law, which says if you're more than 2 or 3 generations broken from the lineage of someone traceable to having indigenous ancestry, you cannot claim. In Canada, being a status Indian. That's what the law says, okay? So what the Odanak were doing is importing a Canadian definition of what it means to be legally recognized as an indigenous person in Canada and saying, okay, Vermonters, you did this by a legislative action, you shouldn't do that, you should replace it with our Canadian law. That's what it all boils down to, okay? Incredibly harmful. If you grow up in a household in Vermont feeling and believing and knowing that you're Abenaki, or if you're just an ally of them, as I am, or if you're just another indigenous person in Vermont, you begin to wonder, when are they going to come after you? Okay? Where does this stop? So what happened in the aftermath of the events at UVM is my Abenaki friends and colleagues here began to try to explain why they didn't have the kind of documentation that Canadians require. They've now done a much better job explaining that they actually do have a lot of that documentation, but for about 2 years, the argument was over, why didn't you produce the documents? And the response of some Vermont Abenaki was, well, we hid the records. You know, there really wasn't much benefit being identified as being indigenous on this side of the border. In fact, it was quite harmful because, you've heard the term Brandon School, that's where they sent indigenous people to be sterilized. Because the Vermont state legislature believed that non-whites were going to threaten this vastly, overwhelmingly white population in Vermont. Mind you, at the time, and now, Vermont remains among the very top 1 or 2 white states in the United States. But it was a fear, the same fear that we're experiencing now in the United States. So the Abenaki, tried to say, well, we had good reasons, we didn't want to be sent to the, to the school to be sterilized. So some people, the critics, again, the Odanak came back and brought their experts and said, well, we've looked at the records and we don't see a whole lot of your names listed in those records. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. My response to that, and anyone who is of color or a minority ethnicity in this group will know, you don't have to have a family member who's been directly threatened. If you're a black parent and you know of a 14-year-old across town who's just been assaulted or killed by the police because they're black and they held up a cell phone, which somebody jumped to the conclusion was a gun, and they killed your son, you don't have to have your name in the police record to be intimidated and terrorized by a climate of opinion which is threatening. I'm here to say that the climate of opinion in Vermont was and is, apropos of my experience with the Wall Street Journal, in this safe state of Vermont, still intimidating and threatening to Native Americans. Why? Let's forget the eugenics Brandon argument for a moment. Let's take it off the table just for a moment for the sake of argumentation. In the early 19th century, when my grandfather came back from World War I, along with many other black soldiers, he came back on a ship and he was listed as non-white. Okay? When he came back, there was this hope that we had just fought a war to save democracy. Black people, Native American people felt maybe now that we've served our country, we'll go home and we'll be treated as full citizens and have full rights. They stood up for those rights. Some of you may know what happened to the black population in an affluent neighborhood in Topeka, Kansas, when they claimed those rights. There was a massacre. They burned down that part of the city. Somewhere between 60 and 150 black people were killed for asserting their rights. What is less well known is that indigenous people in the city were also killed. That would be enough to discourage me, if I lived in Vermont at that time, from stepping forward and saying, hey, by the way, I'm one of those people you just decided to erase. Another example, the Ku Klux Klan became active in Vermont at this time. There were cross burnings. You can find them documented in the newspaper. There's been a book written about it. If the Ku Klux Klan is burning crosses and intimidating non-white people, and you're an indigenous person who's considered non-white, would you want to stand up and say, hey, I just want to be recognized as an indigenous person? No. Final example, struck home with me. Some of you saw a couple of years ago this award-winning movie. It was called Killers of the Flower Moon. It's about the Osage this tribe in I think it's California, who had the good fortune / misfortune of having oil discovered on their land. At the time, it was actually the world's biggest and wealthiest oil deposit. Good news! After 100, 200, 300 years of wallowing in poverty, we're going to live like rich people in the United States. The people in the Osage tribe went out and bought 3, 4, 5, 6 Pierce Arrow cars. They really flaunted their wealth. And as a result, white people married them and then began to systematically kill them. That's what the film is about. That's what the book is about. Now, this is not some little footnote in history. This was on the front page of the New York Times, just like the Topeka massacres. So indigenous people in Vermont grew up not just worried about a, quote, relatively small number of people being sterilized at the Brandon School. They grew up constantly reading stories in the newspapers and talking among themselves about how this country comes to get you and to erase you. So the point I'm trying to make is that being an indigenous person in Vermont is daily pushback on attempts to erase us. It isn't just humiliating, it isn't just an indignity or an insult, to use the language of my petition. It is physically harmful to your health to live under such stress. I know. I had to take a 9-month sabbatical from being an ally with the Abenaki because it got too much for me. And I'm not Abenaki. Just working with Abenaki who suffer from this got to me. So let me flip back to the event at UVM, and I don't want to delve into it and dwell on it because the media will pick up on this and they'll run the usual story of, yeah, but, what's he complaining about? They're all fake Indians. The Odanak have proved that, okay? I don't want to deal with that. I asked a question, and I'm bringing that question here today, and it's part of my answer to what do I want the state to do to correct the injustice. So here was my question. After I saw the UVM event, I'm a historian by training and a researcher, the question that popped into my mind was, who paid for that event? Who paid for the so-called experts? Now, this is a big question in the field of scientific research in America now. You can't publish a study on the effectiveness of a drug or medication without disclosing where your funding sources came from, because everybody knows that he who pays the piper calls the tune. So somehow, I can't even remember how it was, I was told that the Canadian government had funded the first UVM event. It wasn't announced, but at the beginning of the first UVM event, the Consul General, next level down from ambassador, to the United States, whose office was in Boston, stood up and introduced the conference, saying, well, this is going to make some people uncomfortable, but we have to get at the truth. His Quebec province counterpart stood up and made the same speech. It's unusual for people of such high diplomatic status to appear in public to announce such a controversial kind of event. So I immediately wrote both people a letter saying, could you please give me an opportunity to talk to you and discuss your funding of the event? Well, the federal council of representing all of Canada never responded to my letter, but the Quebec council did. She and I had a lovely, almost half an hour, 45-minute conversation. And out of it came two things. One is she volunteered to fund a follow-up event that might try to have some kind of reconciliation and not just a thumb in the eye. she changed her position and we never followed up on that. But I asked her, I said, so why did you fund this? And she said, I didn't fund it. It was the council's office that funded it. Okay? So what's the significance of that? Let me explain. A friend of mine, recently deceased, was the U.S. consul to the province of Quebec during their called Tranquil Revolution. It was an enormous shattering of the political structure in Quebec. And he made it very clear when Carolyn and I had lunch with him that he could be an observer, but that it is a grotesque, grievous breach of diplomatic protocol for a foreigner to intervene in the domestic affairs of a neighboring nation. I know you're all thinking, well, doesn't the CIA do this all the time? Yes, they do. But it is still a breach of ethics and international law. So that's not a very good cover story. So my point, number one, is what the Canadian government funded and what perhaps the Odanak funded. They are a semi-sovereign First Nation. What those two entities funded was a violation of diplomatic protocol. Why hasn't the media tracked that down? Why hasn't the Vermont legislature that voted to give recognition to our own resident Indigenous people, why haven't they asked for the records on this? Why haven't they asked the University of Vermont through a kind of Freedom of Information Act request or testimony before the legislature to bring in the budget reports explaining where the money came for that event? And that wasn't the last event. There have been two more events just like that. After UVM's provost gave an apology saying this doesn't meet our academic and scholarly standards. There's the words, and there's the deed. But we're going to do it again. Nobody has asked that question about the Odanak going to the United Nations, putting on a presentation claiming that our Indigenous people here violated some kind of human rights by denying them their human rights. Huh? That was an expensive journey. And some of you may have seen it. I've got the screenshot at home, and I'll submit it in my written follow-up testimony. On Times Square, for those who've been there, there's this giant digital bulletin board, bigger than that, at the end of a building. The Odanak rented that digital bulletin board to accuse the Vermont Abenaki of taking away their Indigenous heritage. That ain't cheap. Who paid for that? So this is the part of my presentation I call Follow the Money Trail. How many times have we heard that? How many times have we seen it in detective movies or read it, in books? Why haven't state legislators, why haven't Vermont media said it's time to follow the money trail and find out who's behind the attacks? And then perhaps another untold story of why did those people who funded these attacks fund those attacks, which are ongoing. For those of you who are Abenaki or follow such things, the most recent shoe dropped this week, another attack. Only, unfortunately, for those of us who are Indigenous, forget, this ghastly image is coming to me. The other shoe drop is, the person who lives upstairs and has 2 feet, and you hear one, and you have to wait until the other one drops before you can go back to sleep. Well, if you're Indigenous and you're living in Vermont, you live downstairs from a centipede. It's not one shoe or two shoe, it's a new shoe every day. And there are a lot more shoes to come if the state of Vermont does not take the upper hand and push back to defend the action it so rightfully and boldly took, recognizing Vermont Abenaki as an Indigenous people. And I'm here to tell you, it doesn't just affect Vermont Abenaki. If you're Indigenous, like I am, it's harm to us as well. It's frightening to us as well. So, my wish for this Thanksgiving is that by some miracle the Wall Street Journal won't run this editorial again. Good luck, Randy. My wish is that we might in this state actually become thankful instead of sometimes strangely silent about the attacks on our Abenaki people, and that our state leaders will develop more backbone and begin to say, yeah, we need to do more than issuing a nice letter saying, you know, we affirm our recognition of you. No, it's not just about the recognition, it's about the moral and ethical and emotional climate of having your identity denied day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. I was tempted, and I dropped it out of my presentation, you know, to go into a thing refuting all of the ridiculous arguments that the Abenaki brought down. I'll spend like 1 minute on it. The essence of their accusation, using 19th century racialized law, is that, again, I alluded to it, that indigeneity legally in Canada requires that you have this very close genealogical connection which you can document, okay? That law was passed in Canada in order to erase people from the tribal rolls, because in Canada, Canada's treaties obligate the federal government to rather significant funding for education and medical support of Indigenous people. But if you've got an Indigenous law that says after intermarriage, and each marriage cuts the bloodline, blood quantum in half, and 1/4 is the cutoff point, eventually you get rid of, you erase the Indigenous people. How convenient. That's what the Canadian government and the Odanak were trying to and are trying to import into Vermont. I would be glad to meet the whole blasted panel of experts that they parade through UVM. I would gladly meet 1 on 12 because I have read their research. I'm a trained historian. I have looked at the footnotes in their research where they claim that this expert supports what they're saying. It isn't true. It's horrific research, if you want to call it that. So we'll put that aside, and I'll just conclude by saying that sometimes it's not harm resulting from action. Sometimes what we experience at harm is inaction. And in this case, as lukewarm and as welcome as the few voices in Vermont have been standing behind the Abenaki, the majority of our leaders have been lukewarm, and the legislature has been not even quite lukewarm. It's time for them to stand up and use their investigative powers, their subpoena powers, to follow the money trail. And it's time for our elected leaders to do what leaders can do if they're true leaders, which is to show moral leadership and say, enough is enough. This stinks. We want it ended. So, I don't want my relatively mild, once removed experience of the indignity of erasure to eclipse or overwhelm the story I know my Abenaki friends and colleagues are trying to tell. But I am trying to make a very simple point, which is if this guy is getting this one step removed, try to empathize, a term that you've used many times today, try to empathize with what it's like to wake up as Abenaki in Vermont. I don't want to give the impression that Abenaki feel they're crushed. No way. They're doing wonderful things, reviving their language and their teachings and their customs and their ceremony and documenting their presence here. But the headwind of daily, weekly, monthly denunciation cannot be underestimated as psychological and physical harm. It has to end. So that's my story of harm. One footnote, and if my distant Abenaki relatives from Odanak were here, and we are relatives, Potawatomi and the Abenaki all came from the first light peoples who migrated 800 or 1,000 years ago from the coast of Canada. They settled, Abenaki settled in northern New England and Quebec. My people kept going until we, quote, found the place where food grows on water. That was the prophecy that we were to follow. That's wild rice. But we're connected, so I have this affinity. So I just want to say that I'm trying to use my second-hand experience of this harm to give those of you who haven't taken the time to imagine what it's like to be suffering from this kind of accusation, denunciation, and insult, to give you a moment to ask, what is really going on? How is it felt? And isn't it time to follow the money trail? Thank you. That's all I have to say.
I feel like you addressed some of the ways that the state legislature or recommendations could be. But just for clarity, I just want to make sure we end on that note of how you would recommend for our future to be different.
I think that, and I mean, we could be having this discussion on the national level in this room right now. I think our leadership, you know, whether it's the governor or people occupying other state offices, need to send out a message that here in Vermont, we don't tolerate bigotry and hatred. I actually thought of titling my presentation Bullying, because sitting as a witness previously, I've heard stories of bullying. And this is essentially what the Odanak are doing, is bullying. So there's a cross-cutting theme in much of what the TRC is dealing with, which is we are becoming a bullying culture at an accelerating rate, which is beyond anyone's worst fears. So let's put a stop to it. I'm asking for it to come from the top, dealing with a big group of people. Other people have come before you and said, I have a son or a daughter, you know, who's black or biracial or, you know, neurodiverse, you know, has autism, or is actually just a really bright kid and he's viewed as an oddball, so he's beat up on the playground. And when I go to the school administrators about it, what do I get? Well, your son punched the kid who called him, you know, I won't use the names. The victims are getting punished. We need to make it clear that this is a state that doesn't tolerate bullying, whether it's across borders in violation of international protocol or it's on the playground, because we're teaching bullying in our school playgrounds and in our schools. That's where it's taking root. So the TRC, I'm hoping, can have a rather clear message that will resonate beyond just Native American, black-white issues to something that every parent can deal with. Because one of the testimonies I heard is the bullying perpetrator basically telling the victim, commit suicide, you jerk. Okay? We've got to put an end to this. Okay. Thank you for your
Thank
question.
you, Randy.
Thank you.
Real quick, if we Thank you. So before we go off and eat and break bread together and just end the day, we wanted to share some of the things that we also do at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so today's experience of listening to the truths that Vermonters hold is at the heart of the Truth and Reconciliation experience. So someone once referred to TRCs in general as listening exercises. But it's not all we do. A large component of our work centers upon research and bringing a common memory to Vermonters with all voices at the table. So for those ancestors and community members that have passed on, their truths are held in family stories, archives, vital records, and sometimes the media. And our research of uncovering truth also brings memories back of many voices that have not always been heard or appreciated. So we wanted to share just a few stories, a few letters, a few voices of people that have been silenced. And we do have one of our experts here and other folks that have, a lot of folks that have been helping us. So we appreciate all of them. So I have two pieces. And what I'm going to do is I'm redacting names and institutions because I don't want anyone to be outed, right? The first letter comes in February of 1942, and it is from one superintendent to another of two different Vermont institutions. So the first says, "Dear Mrs. A, replying to yours as," oh, sorry, no, we'll do this wrong one. Okay. "Dear Mr. C, we have been trying for some time to determine whether this person has ever been sterilized. I believe your records will show that at one time they were an inmate of your institution, but was transferred to ours years ago. I saw them last night, and they informed me that when they were 17 and while an inmate at your institution, they had an operation for appendicitis, at which time they removed one ovary and performed an operation for sterilization on the other side. As their mentality is not too high, I take statements with a grain of salt, although I'm inclined to believe something of that nature happened to her. What makes it seem," sorry, these are older copies, so I'm trying to read through this. "What makes it seem doubtful to me is the fact that she stated that doctor," they actually gave the doctor's name, "was the operating surgeon, and that the operation was performed at Fanny Allen Hospital, which didn't click with their procedure. I would very much appreciate you looking this up in the records. Very truly yours." So this person, who ended up, from what I gather, actually died at the same institution just over a decade later. Okay, they were in the state institutions, multiple, for basically the majority of their life. The response is 1942. And so I just want to clarify that the sterilization law, which came about in the early 1930s, this person who was 17 at the time, would have been in the 1910s. Okay, so this is about 16 or so years before that law came out. So 1942, "Dear Mrs. A, replying to yours as of February 11th regarding the person, would say that our records indicate that they were transferred from this institution to yours in 1916. Back in those days, there was no folder covering the children here, and very few records were kept. But what we do not have, we do not indicate any major operations, no references to sterilization, and as a matter of fact, I question very much whether they were doing these operations in 1916. Regretting we cannot give you more information, I remain yours sincerely, Superintendent. And honestly, that's their truth at this point, right? Like, one of the things we do as a listening exercise is to believe people. So, the next one I have is from a little bit later. So this one is 1960s, and I'm not gonna be any more specific, but this person, and I'm sorry, some of this is kind of cut off, so I'm trying not to cough, so I'm sorry if I'm kind of weird. So my son is in your institution. So dear Mr. K, my son is in your institution and has been since August. And I'm sorry, this one always gets me. And he is being mistreated. This is just thinking about my own children. And we see a lot of letters from mothers about their children in these institutions. And it kind of gets to me sometimes. And this one got to me. So and they're being mistreated. I would like to have something done about it. After all, he is my son. And how I know I am his own mother, and that the state has hurt him in many ways. And since he has been 5 years old, and I would like to have you look in right away before he's hurt anymore. I didn't sign him into this place, and they just come here and they took him. And would you please talk with Mr. K, Governor? And he has something to do with this. I think you should help all of the poor as well as the rich. I am poor and I am not well, and I would like my boy home with me. Sorry. I have a good home. It's clean and all he wants to eat. I can give him better care than what he is getting now. And I showed the letter you wrote, and they just laugh. And I was hurt in the same institution. It made me disabled. I've got only one hand that I can use. They put me in another institution so they wouldn't have to give me anything. The state pays cops to ride around the street to see what kids they can pick up to make 5 cents and make outlaws of teenagers. And I think the state should pay their cripples and leave these kids alone. The state has got a good money racket. They sell number plates for $32. They have made them nothing. They're made for nothing by men. They got locked up in prisons and jail. The state has taken money from the poor people all their life, and now the state owes me $42,000 for my disability, and won't, I think there's a word missing, pay it. My boy couldn't write to you, so he asked me to write for him. I want an answer in a week. So, thank you from the mother. Isn't that just heartbreaking to read? And to know that all they wanted was their kid home and to take care of them. And I did verify they were in an institution, and they were permanently disabled by an accident that happened at a Vermont institution, which left them without a limb, at least one limb. And it took them a very long time to recover in the other institution that they were placed. And so this is not just one, this is representing one child, but multi-generational, and it brings in children over time and their families and continuous issues that happen over generations. And so I just wanted to bring this letter up because these two in particular, what are they saying to you? How would you address this? How would you take this in? What do you think about it? And so that's all we wanted to share from the historical piece, but we're finding a lot of letters like this. Sometimes it's hard to read, right? So just keep in mind all the people that their childhoods ended too early. So thank you. Thanks for being here. And now we're gonna.
This is you.
Oh, what am I doing?
Transitioning.
Oh, I think.
That was a lot. Thank Randy.
That was a lot. And it's a glimpse of what it's uncovered. So we're gonna just take a moment. Thank you to Randy, thank you to Melody for bringing the truths here with us. Take a little deep breath. Inhale those truths. Exhale what no longer serves us, what doesn't need to stay. Inhale and honor yourself for being witness today. Breathe at your own pace. We're going to take just a moment of silence. Look around the room. Your feet on the ground. And thank you.
Thank you guys again for coming. We really appreciate it. Right now, we're going to have our local lunch sponsored by caterer Tomorrow Musto of Rutland. So please relax, don't move too fast, just ease back into this wonderful fall day. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all.
Thank you. And our next event is November 15th in St. Johnsbury.